It may not seem like it, but this mundane moment from Hirokazu-Koreda's Maborosi is rather significant for its protagonist Yumiko. It's been over 5 years since the suicide of her first husband, and even after remarrying, she is still recovering. This is really the first time it feels like she's going to be okay, and it's not a big dramatic moment of catharsis, no. For Kore-eda, a part of overcoming grief is about investing in the everyday. It's an idea he even embeds within this frame. The deep focused depth of field, the tightness of the composition, the warm sunlight, the light costume design. It all creates a sense of harmony and unity. And it all reinforces how sometimes it's the most boring activities that pull us away from the tragedies of our past and bring us closer to those around us in our present. Grief is different for everyone. We all follow our own convoluted paths through it and out of it. Accordingly, it's been expressed through the medium of film in just about as many different ways as it manifests. Some filmmakers aim to capture outward grief, emphasizing emotional outbursts, close-ups of crying faces, and dramatic action. Others are more interested in externalizing inward grief, evoking it rather than explicitly showing it. Both approaches are completely appropriate and effective, but it's that inward approach I want to talk about today. In a 1999 interview, Kore-eda said, "I thought I'd try to create a different kind of emotional expression that didn't depend on close-ups of crying faces to communicate the character's feelings. I was experimenting to see how much I could communicate by making the light and shadow and sounds reverberate within the frame. The composition of the shots also were intended to evoke Yumiko's interior landscape." What we get then is a film that embraces the unique properties of cinema to create an expressionistic vision of grief. What's more is that Kore-eda uses this approach to explore the ebb and flow of grief, how it comes and goes over the passage of time, and what the moments in between can look like. Ultimately, it's a film that speaks to me and my own experiences with loss more than any other film on the subject. So let's take a closer look into what Kore-eda has to say about grief and how he expresses it. This is Ikuo, Yumiko's first husband. And this is Maborosi's mystery scene. Ikuo is shown rushing down the dimly lit roads of Amagasaki until he stops right here. It's not clear why, but the oncoming train calls out to him, and we get the sense that something is amiss. While Ikuo's life with Yumiko and their 3-month-old son Yuichi seems relatively cheerful, one day Yumiko watches him as he walks off to work, and the longer the shot goes on, the more it feels like we're never gonna see him again. And sure enough, that night, he never returns. According to the police, he walked in front of a speeding train, not reacting to its whistle or its screeching brakes. This is the first time we see Yumiko react to the information. She's in a car on the way to the police station, and instead of showing her cry, Kore-eda lets the rain rolling down the window do it for her. He evokes her suffering rather than explicitly showing it. Soon after, we come to learn that all Ikuo has left behind is a tiny bell attached to his keys, his green bicycle, a fatherless child, and of course, a distraught wife, forever stuck with the question, why? A question that for the majority of the film is left painfully unasked and unanswered. What I find fascinating is that Kore-eda then skips over the next 5 years of Yumiko's life, bringing our attention instead to her arranged remarriage for the remainder of the film. But why choose this specific point in time to tell the rest of her story? I find it no coincidence that Yumiko's journey to her second husband's hometown begins by train, a leitmotif for Ikuo's death. So it seems that despite all the time that's passed, the memory of Ikuo and the grief that it inspires are still with her. They travel with her, even as she attempts to move on. How it all affects her, how she copes, specifically as she starts a new life with a new family, is what Kore-eda is interested in. He elaborates on this in the following quotes. "It's not so much death," he says, "but what those left behind choose to do with the time that remains. My greatest theme in documentary and narrative is how people overcome the violence of a loss and deal with the memories that now exist only on one side." And so, on Yumiko's first night in her new home, that alienation is evoked through the foreign sound of the overwhelming ocean. It's imbued in the composition, how Yumiko is in the background, physically distanced from Tamio in the foreground. And more tellingly, it's in the lighting. Tamio is shrouded in absolute darkness, emphasizing the more symbolic distance between the two, or perhaps the void left by another. One day, Yuichi and his new stepsister, Tomoko, venture out to explore the town. Meanwhile, Yumiko is shown waiting for them to return, time passing slowly and painfully, all of which recall her anxious wait for Ikuo. Kore-eda even goes so far as to show the kids traversing a tunnel, further recalling Yumiko's grief. On these shots, he is quoted saying, "What I intended was for people to feel a little danger in that scene, to smell a bit of death." But then there's a change. It's barely noticeable, but its implications are vast, and it's in this seamless edit right here. The kids are suddenly wearing different clothes, summer is just around the corner, and Yumiko's reaction to their return is not relief as we may have expected. She greets them as if it were any other day. For me, that edit means just one thing. With time, the memory of that which haunts us can fade. This is my favorite sequence in Maborosi. Summer has arrived in earnest, and with the further passage of time comes a sense of harmony, a sense of peace for Yumiko. Going back to my very first point, there are no grand moments of catharsis here, just a quiet celebration of the restorative power of the quotidian. Kore-eda explains this in the following quote. "I was asked so many times, why do you keep those shots of eating and cleaning so long? My answer was that these small, everyday details are not important to the film, but are the most important things for Yumiko. Little events built up in everyday life are essential to her." Thus, we arrive back at this shot, and if we compare it to her first night, it's clear that with the passage of time, and through the simple act of indulging in the dailiness of life, the distance and darkness that once pervaded has now given way to intimacy and light. It's interesting to me then that immediately after all of this, we arrive here, in a train. Yumiko finds herself pulled back to her past, to Amagasaki for her brother's wedding. And in the act of retreading old ground, Kore-eda has her face an onslaught of reminders of her loss. There are passing bicycles, the ringing of their bells, and soon, guided perhaps by a need for closure, a need for an answer to that unanswered question, why, she visits his workplace and their old home. This feels like Kore-eda's way of exploring how our desires to maintain harmony in our present can often clash with the unpredictable nature of our most painful memories. In other words, even as we're moving on, grief may suddenly reappear right in front of us. And so upon arriving home, Yumiko obsesses over the surviving bell, nervously watches Domino walk off into a winter storm, and hesitates when her son, the ultimate reminder of her tragedy, gravitates towards a green bike. All of this culminates in a climax during which Yumiko sees a passing funeral procession and is compelled to follow behind it, as if, in fact, it were Ikuo's. Linda C. Ehrlich, author of the films of Kore-eda Hirokazu, writes, "We hear the bicycle musical theme, Ikuo's theme, mixed with the sound of a bowed instrument, a combination we haven't heard so far. Two forces work with and against each other in this otherworldly music." Indeed, Yumiko is now more than ever at a crossroads between the past and the present, life and death, a concept further reinforced first by the divided composition of this shot, a tree full of life on one side and a tree completely dead on the other, and second, through this funeral pyre on the left and through the presence of Daimyo on the right. They have to decide whether to keep memories once shared, Kore-eda says, or to erase the past. Ultimately, in finally asking that why question out loud, and entrusting the answer specifically to her second husband, it seems as though Yumiko finally chooses the present and the potential for peace within it. Thus, we arrive back to the everyday, back to summer, back to harmony. Author David Desser of The Imagination of the Transcendent, Kore-eda Hirokazu's Maborosi, comments on this moment best. Kore-eda is too subtle to remind us of the centrality of the bicycle here, as a symbol of transience and loss. Instead, the bike is transformed into an image of dailiness, of the quotidian, a father teaching his son to ride. From here, we get the last lines of the film.
良い気になりましたね。
陽気になったな。
On the surface, these words speak to the arrival of summer, but I have no doubt they also speak to a kind of acceptance towards the balance of life and death, past and present. Desser elaborates, what we need to know is that Yumiko can overcome, transcend this enigma, this mystery, and that she can do so precisely by investing herself in the dailiness of life. She lives not for the highs and lows, but for the moments in between, the only moments we see. And so, our last shot is of a room once foreign and alien, now serene and peaceful.